Listen carefully. This is not folklore, not rumor, not a ghost story whispered by firelight. This is the truth they buried beneath polished floors and clinical language, a truth so corrosive it eats through the very idea of trust. Imagine a locked gate at the edge of Staten Island, rust creeping down iron bars, and behind it, a building that looked like salvation. But the brickwork was a mask, and behind its hollow smile lived a system designed not to heal, but to harvest, not to protect, but to consume. Willowbrook State School. The name itself was chosen with precision, soft, pastoral, almost poetic, a name that mothers and fathers could believe in as they signed their children away. In 1947, the ribbon was cut. Politicians smiled for cameras, administrators made speeches about safety, dignity, education, and the families listened, tired, hopeful, desperate for somewhere to place the children society had already decided it did not want to see. But you must understand this. Institutions rarely begin as monsters. They begin as promises, and promises are the most effective chains ever forged. Parents thought they were surrendering their children to protection. What they surrendered them to was an experiment, not an accident, not neglect, an experiment. Step inside those corridors. The air carries a chill that never fades. The fluorescent hum overhead flattens the hours until morning and night become indistinguishable. The floors are polished but stained. The walls echo with the endless cries of children who would never be heard outside these halls. Imagine hundreds packed into wards, bodies pressed so close they lost the concept of space. Imagine the smell, bleach failing to mask urine, damp wool clinging to frail shoulders, sickness spreading like a shadow that no one intended to stop. Because here's the secret, they didn't want it to stop, they needed it. Hepatitis was not an outbreak inside Willowbrook, it was an inevitability, an infection so common that doctors stopped treating it as a threat and began to treat it as a resource. Blood tests, stool samples, fever charts, children reduced to columns of numbers in notebooks. Their sickness became predictable, like clockwork, and predictability is the foundation of experiment. So ask yourself, when does care become cruelty? When does medicine become manipulation? At Willowbrook, the answer came in the form of chocolate milk laced with virus, small paper cups handed to children who could not know what they were drinking, needles slipping beneath their skin, not to heal but to introduce disease deliberately. They called it research. They called it science. But what it was possession. The state possessed their bodies, and the medical establishment possessed their suffering. Understand this. Those children had no choice. Their parents had no choice. Overcrowding was weaponized into leverage. Sign here, officials said, and your child will be admitted. But in the fine print was the contract with the devil. Consent not for care, but for exposure. Parents desperate for help signed away their bloodlines into the waiting jaws of a machine that wanted subjects more than it wanted students. And the machine did not stop. For years, data flowed out of Willowbrook, charts polished with Ivy League authority, papers published in journals, conferences where the infected bodies of Staten Island's children were translated into elegant tables and citations. Do you see the sleight of hand? In the wards, disease was routine, but in the halls of power, it was knowledge, and knowledge meant prestige, funding, advancement. The price was invisible because it had been hidden inside the walls of a school. This is how power works. It does not announce itself with blood on its hands. It announces itself with promises, paperwork, statistics, and the language of inevitability. Willowbrook was not an aberration. It was a template, a mirror held up to a society that would rather not see the inconvenient, the disabled, the forgotten. They were not hidden away for protection. They were hidden away because suffering in silence is easier to exploit. And once the system realized that silence could be converted into data, into prestige, into vaccine development, the line between medicine and cruelty dissolved entirely. Tonight, I am not here to simply tell you the story of Willowbrook. I am here to pull you into the machinery itself, to show you how neglect becomes normalized, how language disguises cruelty, and how innocence can be repurposed into leverage. This is not a scandal locked in the past. It is a demonstration of how institutions feed on the vulnerable when no one is watching. And once you see it, You cannot unsee it. The gates of Willowbrook are still there, corroded and silent. But the question is this: how many other gates are still open? How many places wear the same mask, promising sanctuary while concealing systems of control? This story is not about them. It is about us, and what we allow ourselves to believe when the brickwork looks convincing. You must understand the architecture of control. Because Willowbrook was not just brick and mortar, it was a blueprint for how institutions command reality. The building stood like a fortress, sprawling across acres of Staten Island, its wings and corridors repeating endlessly like a maze designed to break orientation. To a visitor, it appeared orderly, symmetrical, almost respectable, but that symmetry was a trick. Behind those corridors, the real design was chaos disguised as routine: overcrowded wards, children stacked in rows, attendants overwhelmed to the point of paralysis. It looked like failure, but what if I told you it was function? Neglect in Willowbrook was not an accident. It was systemic, designed into the very ratios of staff to residents. One attendant for dozens, sometimes near 100, children. This imbalance guaranteed shortcuts, and shortcuts guaranteed exposure. A single cloth passed across 10 mouths. A meal cart moving from ward to ward without sterilization. Bathrooms built for a fraction of the residents, forcing children into unhygienic cycles that kept hepatitis alive like an ever-present god of the institution. The disease was not fought, it was maintained, and maintenance is a form of worship. Think about it. The outside world heard school. They imagined teachers, lessons, laughter. But inside, education was an illusion. The true curriculum was suffering. The institution had found a way to turn disease into data, and data into advancement. That is the alchemy of power: to transmute pain into prestige, neglect into research, exploitation into medical progress. They will tell you it was necessary, that vaccines came from this, that humanity benefited. But ask yourself, at what cost? Whose lives were sacrificed, and who decided that their suffering could be converted into a gift for others? The answer is not science. The answer is hierarchy. Those children were deemed less valuable, their voices less important, their existence less visible. In that silence, an opportunity appeared, an opportunity to conduct experiments that could never be justified on those with power, wealth, or visibility. So they chose the voiceless. They chose the children locked away behind the gates of Willowbrook, children already abandoned by society, whose cries would never echo beyond those walls. In this way, medicine merged with politics, and politics merged with control. What you see in Willowbrook is not just cruelty, it is the naked face of institutional logic when it is freed from accountability. Step into the hepatitis unit. The smell of disinfectant is sharp, masking but never erasing the underlying stench of illness. A nurse moves down the row with paper cups. Some are filled with milk, others with milk deliberately contaminated with stool carrying the virus. To the children, they are all the same. To the researchers, the difference is everything. A child drinks. Their fate is sealed. Fever will rise, skin will yellow, blood will be drawn, labeled, stored. In the records, their initials become a number. The fever becomes a data point. Their suffering becomes a result. And the result becomes a line in a scientific paper that will travel far beyond the ward, screw, bed of its origin, presented as progress. This is how corruption speaks, softly, clinically, hiding in plain sight. No overt torture, no dramatic cruelty, just the slow erosion of dignity, one protocol at a time. Parents were told it was inevitable, their children would get sick anyway. Better to get sick in a controlled way, they were told. Better to let science learn from it. But inevitability is not permission. Inevitability is the weapon they used to justify making suffering into strategy. It is the same logic used by every empire, every institution that thrives on the powerless. You will suffer anyway, so let us own your suffering. That is the creed of domination disguised as care. Do you see now how deep this goes? Willowbrook was not simply a medical scandal. It was a demonstration of how human beings can be redefined as raw material. And once a human being is redefined as material, anything can be justified. The paper trail shows consent forms. But look closer. Parents desperate for placement were told there was no space. except in the research unit. Their choice was no choice at all. Let your child be exposed, or let your child be left outside. This is not consent. This is coercion. And coercion is the language of every dark system that hides behind the mask of legitimacy. Inside the wards, the children lay in cribs or on the floor, some naked, some shivering under thin blankets. Attendants moved like shadows, rushing from one to another, unable to offer more than a passing touch. The soundscape was relentless. The hiss of radiators, the squeak of shoes, the cries and murmurs of children lost in cycles of fever and neglect. It did not sound like a school. It did not sound like healing. It sounded like captivity. And that sound was swallowed by silence outside, because the world did not want to know. That silence was the shield that allowed the machine to continue. Understand this. When Robert F. Kennedy visited in 1965 and called Willowbrook a snake pit, he was not exaggerating. He was naming what everyone inside already knew, that this was not care, it was containment, not treatment, but warehousing. But do you know what happened after his words echoed across the nation? Almost nothing. Reports were written, promises were made, budgets were drafted. But inside the walls, the rhythm of neglect continued unbroken. That is the lesson of Willowbrook. Exposure does not guarantee change. Power protects itself. Systems absorb criticism and keep moving forward, reshaping themselves just enough to survive the storm. Meanwhile, the children continued to drink from cups they did not understand. And so the question falls to you. If such a thing could happen in plain sight, with the name of a school and the blessing of doctors, how many other places are still hidden behind names that sound safe, respectable, clean? How many other Willowbrooks stand in the shadows right now, disguised as progress, as necessity, as care? Once you begin to see this pattern, you cannot return to ignorance. Because Willowbrook is not only history, it is revels. It is the whisper of a truth too dangerous for polite society to admit, that power feeds on the powerless, and institutions are built not to protect, but to consume. What you must realize is this: Willowbrook was never just about children, or hepatitis, or overcrowded wards. It was about proving something far more disturbing, that an entire society can be conditioned to accept atrocity so long as it is wrapped in the language of necessity. Think of it as an experiment in mass psychology as much as in medicine. Every parent who signed the consent forms, every official who turned a blind eye, every researcher who wrote glowing scientific reports, they were all participants in a larger test. How much horror will the public tolerate if it is labeled progress? The truth is, Willowbrook did not exist in isolation. It was part of a wider landscape of control that stretched across the 20th century. The Tuskegee syphilis study, the Cold War radiation experiments, the CIA's MK-Ultra program. Different methods, different victims, but the same underlying formula: secrecy, authority, and the silencing of the vulnerable. And when you place Willowbrook beside these others, a pattern becomes visible. It is not random, it is systemic. It is the skeleton of a society that feeds off the margins, that justifies cruelty with science, and that turns human lives into data points on charts meant to serve those in power. Consider the psychology. When the story of Willowbrook finally reached the public in the early 1970s through Geraldo Rivera's shocking exposé, the outrage was immediate. Viewers saw images of children left unclothed, rocking back and forth in filth, crying out in ways that were barely human. For a moment, America gasped. Politicians made promises, parents demanded reform. But what happened after the gasps faded? The public moved on. The cycle repeated. Horror, outrage, silence. Why? Because atrocity is easier to look away from than to confront, and those in power know this. They count on it. The system relies on the human tendency to forget, to bury, to normalize. That tendency is the real laboratory, the one being tested not on the children but on all of us. Now imagine the inner logic of the researchers. To them this was not cruelty, it was methodology. They saw themselves as rational actors, advancing knowledge, reducing chaos to order. A child with yellowing eyes became a data set. An outbreak became an opportunity. It was not personal. It was clinical. That detachment is what allowed them to proceed. And here lies the most frightening truth. Atrocities rarely come from monsters foaming at the mouth. They come from ordinary professionals, doing their jobs, following protocols, convinced they are serving the greater good. Willowbrook was not built by sadists. It was built by bureaucrats and scientists, people who believed they were reasonable, and that makes it all the more dangerous. This is the psychology of obedience, the same force studied by Stanley Milgram in his electric shock experiments during the very same decade. Ordinary people, instructed by an authority figure, will inflict pain they would never dream of on their own. Willowbrook was Milgram on an institutional scale. Parents obeyed doctors, doctors obeyed research protocols, politicians obeyed funding pressures. Each believed they were powerless, merely fulfilling their role, and in that chain of obedience, horror was made sustainable. That is how systems of cruelty survive. Not by convincing everyone to be evil, but by convincing everyone they have no choice. Look deeper, and you see another layer, the weaponization of language. Words like school, treatment, and research acted like spells, casting a veil over what was really happening. This is what I call linguistic camouflage. A prison becomes a hospital. A test subject becomes a patient. An infection becomes an experiment. Language reshapes perception, and perception reshapes morality. Most people did not see Willowbrook for what it was because the words told them it was something else. And when you control language, you control reality. This is not just a historical fact, it is a present danger. Consider how often in your own life you are told something harmful is necessary, something cruel is inevitable, something unjust is progress. The language of Willowbrook is everywhere, only updated for modern ears. But why does this matter now, decades later? Because the blueprint remains. Every system that consolidates power learns the same lesson. If you want obedience, you must first isolate a group, strip them of their voice, and redefine them as less than fully human. Then you can do anything. In Willowbrook, it was children with developmental disabilities. In other times, it has been prisoners, the poor, the sick, the marginalized. Tomorrow, it could be anyone the system decides is expendable, and the justifications will always sound logical, always sound necessary, always sound like care. Do you feel the weight of that revelation? Because here is the part most people cannot face. Willowbrook was not an anomaly. It was a mirror. It reflected back the cold mechanics of how authority operates when it is unchecked. If you study its structure, you begin to see echoes everywhere. In schools that function like holding cells, in hospitals that prioritize efficiency over empathy, in governments that collect data on citizens the way Willowbrook collected blood samples. Once you know what to look for, you cannot unsee it. The experiment is still running. It has simply changed shape. Think again of those children, their identities reduced to numbers, their pain translated into charts. Then look at the world around you today. Every time you scroll through a feed, every time your movements are tracked by cameras and algorithms, ask yourself, are you still a person, or are you becoming data? The parallels are not abstract, they are direct. Willowbrook was the prototype for a world in which human beings are increasingly seen not as souls, but as metrics, as variables, as material to be managed. The walls of the asylum have expanded, and now they surround us all. And so the real horror of Willowbrook is not only what was done to those children, as unspeakable as that is. The real horror is that the same logic could and does extend outward into society at large. It is the logic of control disguised as care, of coercion disguised as consent, of suffering disguised as progress. If you understand Willowbrook, you understand the machinery of obedience itself. And once you understand it, you are faced with a choice: to continue playing your role in the chain of obedience, or to step outside it and see the system for what it is. But beware, once you step outside, there is no going back. To see the truth is to lose the comfort of ignorance. Yet maybe that is what those children demand of us, even now, that their suffering was not in vain. that their cries echo beyond the wards into the conscience of those willing to listen, that we learn not only what happened in Willowbrook, but what Willowbrook reveals about us all. When most people hear about Willowbrook today, they treat it as a closed chapter, a historical wound, a cautionary tale, but that assumption is the real danger, because Willowbrook was not a closed experiment, it was a prototype. Its walls may have crumbled, but its logic survived, quietly embedding itself in modern systems that are cleaner, shinier, but no less controlling. You see, the asylum never disappeared. It evolved. Look at the digital world around you. Every app, every platform, every device is collecting information about you. Where you go, what you eat, how you sleep, who you love. They call it data. They call it personalization. They call it progress. But strip away the language, and what you see is the same process Willowbrook perfected. The reduction of human lives into units of measurement. A child with hepatitis in the 1960s became a line on a medical chart. Today, your movements become dots on a heat map. Different tools, same dehumanization. You are no longer simply living, you are being monitored, analyzed, optimized, and like those children, you never truly gave informed consent. Consider the word consent itself. At Willowbrook, parents were told participation was optional, but without it, their children would be denied placement. A false choice. Today you click, I agree to terms of service you never read, because without it, you cannot use the platform, the software, the service that society now demands of you. Another false choice. Consent without freedom is not consent at all. It is coercion disguised as agreement. The pattern remains unchanged. The illusion of choice conceals the reality of control. This is why Willowbrook matters. It shows us the blueprint. Step 1. Isolate a group. In that case, disabled children. Step 2. Control the narrative. Call it a school. Call it treatment. Call it research. Step 3. Normalize the exploitation by presenting it as necessary. Today, the same steps apply. Step 1. Isolate individuals digitally, each trapped in their personalized feed, their curated algorithm. Step 2. Control the narrative. Call it convenience, call it personalization, call it progress. Step 3. Normalize surveillance and data extraction by telling you it is inevitable, even beneficial. The asylum has been rebuilt, only now its walls are invisible, and we live inside it voluntarily. You may think, but Willowbrook was about suffering, about bodies, about disease. Surely this is different. Look closer. The difference is only in surface detail. In both cases, human beings are treated not as ends in themselves, but as means to an end. In Willowbrook, children's pain became data to advance medical careers and pharmaceutical breakthroughs. Today, your behavior becomes data to feed algorithms and corporations. In both, the individual is sacrificed for the system, and in both, the language of progress makes the sacrifice palatable. Remember this: systems of control rarely announce themselves as prisons. They announce themselves as protection. The asylum promised safety, education, care. Today's systems promise security, personalization, convenience. Both deliver the opposite. What Willowbrook teaches us is that exploitation always hides behind benevolence. The smiling face of the attendant handing a cup of milk, the friendly interface of your phone asking for permission. The surface feels harmless. The reality is extractivist. And what of the watchers themselves? At Willowbrook, the researchers believed they were serving humanity. They were not sadists. They were professionals convinced of their own righteousness. Today's data engineers, algorithm designers, and AI researchers often speak the same way. They tell you they are optimizing your life, making society safer, advancing progress. But progress for whom? Safety for whom? These are the same questions parents should have asked when doctors at Willowbrook assured them the experiments were harmless, even beneficial. The tragedy is that once again, authority is cloaked in the aura of expertise, and once again, we are too quick to trust. Think of the architecture of Willowbrook: endless corridors, identical wards, a labyrinth that stripped orientation. Now compare that to the architecture of the digital world: social media feeds that loop infinitely, notifications that pull you in without exit, a labyrinth not of walls but of screens. Both are designed to overwhelm autonomy, to replace free choice with guided behavior. In Willowbrook, the children could not leave. In the digital asylum, you believe you can leave, but can you? Can you live without the platforms, the services, the systems that have become the new gatekeepers of daily life? The illusion of freedom is the new form of captivity. Here lies the darkest revelation. The experiment never ended. It simply scaled. Willowbrook was a controlled environment where researchers studied disease transmission. Today, our society itself is the laboratory where corporations and governments study behavior transmission, how misinformation spreads, how outrage circulates, how compliance can be engineered. Instead of hepatitis, the virus is ideology. Instead of blood samples, the data is your clicks, your likes, your fears. The logic is the same. Treat people as material, not as individuals. And what happens when you resist? At Willowbrook, there was no way out. Parents who objected faced waiting lists, denial of placement, social pressure. Today, you can try to opt out of surveillance, but you are met with the same barriers: exclusion, inconvenience, penalties. Try living without a phone, a bank account, an internet connection. The system makes resistance nearly impossible, so compliance becomes the path of least resistance. That is not freedom. That is captivity by design. Do you see how the pattern loops across decades? First, isolate, then redefine, then normalize. Always with the same script. It is for your own good. And every time the public complies, not out of malice but out of fatigue, out of trust, out of fear. This is the true lesson of Willowbrook. It was not only a tragedy of children abandoned in filth. It was a demonstration of how entire societies can be lulled into complicity. And if you think you are immune now, ask yourself, what horrors are you tolerating today because they are wrapped in the right language, delivered by the right authorities, hidden behind the right walls? Some will argue, but look, vaccines came from Willowbrook, public health improved, lives were saved, and they are not wrong. But this is the trap. Every system of exploitation can point to benefits. The question is not whether progress was made. The question is whether the cost was just. Progress built on coercion is not progress. It is theft. And theft does not stop at the walls of the asylum. It expands, it mutates, it evolves until an entire culture accepts theft as normal, exploitation as progress, captivity as care. Which brings us to now, right now, in your world. The same logic of Willowbrook surrounds you, dressed in new clothes. If you want to see the asylum clearly, look not for brick walls and locked wards, but for the invisible chains of data, consent, and compliance. The systems are bigger now, more sophisticated, but the hunger is the same. Power feeds on the powerless. Institutions thrive by redefining lives as material. And once again, the question falls to you. Will you accept the role of patient, subject, data point, or will you step outside the narrative and see the asylum for what it truly is? When you strip away the names, the buildings, the decades, you are left with something primal: captivity. That is the essence of Willowbrook and of every institution like it. Not just the captivity of children within walls, but the captivity of minds within systems of thought. Because here is the unsettling truth. Captivity does not require chains. It requires obedience. And obedience can be manufactured with nothing more than structure, authority, and fear. Think about the logic of institutions. They exist to organize chaos, to provide order. That is the story they tell us. But order has a cost, and that cost is autonomy. In Willowbrook, autonomy was stripped completely. Children could not choose what they ate, where they slept, when they spoke. But the attendants too were captives. Overwhelmed by impossible staff-to-patient ratios, bound by protocols, locked into obedience. And even the researchers, in their own way, were captives of the scientific system that demanded results, publications, prestige. Everyone inside the asylum was imprisoned by something. That is the secret. Captivity does not only hold the powerless, it entangles everyone, each according to their role. So ask yourself, what is obedience? At Willowbrook, it looked like parents signing forms because they were told it was necessary. It looked like doctors following research protocols because the institution demanded it. It looked like attendants doing the bare minimum to survive impossible conditions. Obedience is not merely following orders. Obedience is surrendering judgment to the system, telling yourself, "I have no choice." That phrase, "no choice," is the cornerstone of captivity, and the system reinforces it at every turn. This is why Willowbrook is not history, but prophecy, because today you hear the same words everywhere. You have no choice but to use this platform. You have no choice but to share this data. You have no choice but to comply with this policy. The asylum has become global, and its strongest weapon is not walls, but inevitability. Once you accept inevitability, you no longer resist, and once you no longer resist, captivity becomes invisible. Let's return to the wards for a moment. Imagine the endless rows of cribs, children rocking, murmuring, lost in cycles of repetition. What is rocking, if not the body's attempt to create rhythm in the absence of freedom, a way to reclaim control when every other choice is stolen? Now compare that to the way people scroll endlessly through their devices today. The same motion, repeated, comforting in its rhythm, numbing in its effect. Different environment, same impulse, to self-soothe within captivity. You see, captivity does not only shape behavior, it reshapes desire. It teaches you to crave the very routines that keep you contained. This is the genius of institutions. They do not merely trap you, they train you to trap yourself. At Willowbrook, children stopped crying after a while. They adjusted. They learned that resistance was pointless, that silence was safer. In modern life, we adjust too. We stop questioning the endless collection of our data. We stop resisting the erosion of privacy. We tell ourselves it is easier to comply than to fight. And so, captivity becomes culture. It becomes normal. It becomes invisible. But here is the dangerous question. What happens when captivity becomes identity? At Willowbrook, many children never experienced a life outside the institution. For them, the asylum was the world. Their sense of self was shaped entirely within its walls. Now look at today's generation, raised inside digital systems of surveillance and control. Many cannot imagine a world without constant connectivity, without algorithms shaping their choices. For them, the digital asylum is not a prison, it is simply life. This is how captivity evolves, not by force, but by normalization. Some might argue, but society needs order, needs structure, needs institutions. True, but the problem is not structure itself. The problem is when structure becomes absolute, when it feeds on the vulnerable, when it disguises exploitation as care. That is the philosophical core of captivity. It hides beneath the promise of protection. Willowbrook promised safety, education, and treatment. It delivered neglect, disease, and exploitation. Today, surveillance promises security, personalization, and convenience. What does it truly deliver? Dependency, manipulation, and control. The promises never match the reality. But by the time you notice, the system has already absorbed you. And this is the hardest part to face. Captivity persists not because of sadists at the top, but because of compliance at every level. The researchers at Willowbrook justified their actions as science. The attendants justified neglect as necessity. The parents justified signing forms as survival. Each step was rational. Each step was explainable. And yet together, they produced horror. This is the paradox. Atrocities are built not by monsters, but by rational people following rules. That is what makes them sustainable. That is why Willowbrook could exist for decades. And that is why modern systems of control thrive now. Do you see the danger? If horror depends on monsters, it is rare. If horror depends on obedience, it is everywhere. Because obedience can be manufactured. Manufactured the rough fear, through authority, through language, through the slow erosion of alternatives. That is the machinery of captivity, and it is humming all around you right now. Not as obvious as locked wards, but as pervasive as the air you breathe. And so, the question returns to you. When you look at Willowbrook, what do you see? Do you see a tragedy of the past, a closed chapter, A scandal that society has outgrown? Or do you see a mirror showing you the outlines of the world you live in now? Because if you see clearly, you will understand. The asylum is not gone. It is everywhere. Its logic is in the schools that prioritize testing over learning, in the hospitals that prioritize billing over healing, in the governments that prioritize data over dignity. It is in every system that tells you, you have no choice. But perhaps the most haunting revelation of all is this. Captivity is seductive. It offers simplicity. It removes uncertainty. It tells you what to do, where to go, how to live. Freedom, by contrast, is heavy. It demands responsibility, courage, vigilance. That is why so many accept captivity without question, because captivity feels easier. And that is the true horror, that most people would rather live inside Willowbrook's walls, so long as those walls are painted with comforting words, than face the terror of freedom beyond them. So, what do we owe to the children of Willowbrook? Not pity, not nostalgia. We owe them clarity. The clarity to recognize captivity when it reappears in new forms. The clarity to reject obedience when it is disguised as inevitability. The clarity to see that their suffering was not only a historical crime, but a warning that systems of control will always find new walls, new words, new disguises, unless we learn to see them for what they are, unless we learn to say no. Willowbrook is not over. It has only shifted its mask. If you want to know what comes next, do not look for brick buildings with barred windows. Look instead at the sleek glass towers of research labs, the glowing screens in your pocket, the silent servers storing oceans of data. The next Willowbrook will not look like a snake pit, it will look like progress, and that is precisely why it will be more dangerous. Picture this: a child born in the near future. From the moment they enter the world, sensors monitor their breathing, their heartbeat, their genetic risks. Their parents, told this is for safety, agree. Consent forms are signed without question, because who would deny protection to a newborn? But that data does not disappear. It flows into databases, into algorithms, into systems that will track that child for life. Every cough, every mood swing, every learning difficulty is recorded. What was once a child is now a profile, a predictive model. The same way Willowbrook children became data points for hepatitis research, this child becomes data for predictive healthcare, behavioral economics, corporate risk assessments. Their humanity dissolves into probability curves. This is captivity reborn. Some will say, but that's different, that's beneficial, that saves lives. And perhaps it will. But remember Willowbrook's justification: the children would get sick anyway, so why not study it? Replace hepatitis with genetic risk, and the logic is identical. The child will be vulnerable anyway, so why not collect the data? Why not learn from it? Do you see how the cycle repeats? The difference is scale. Willowbrook confined hundreds. The new systems will confine millions, invisibly, through algorithms that decide futures before they happen. The next Willowbrook may not be a school, it may be a smart city. Imagine walking through streets where every movement is tracked by cameras, every purchase logged, every conversation analyzed. The justification will be safety, efficiency, convenience. But safety for whom? Convenience for whom? The moment you step outside prescribed behavior, the system will notice. Step out of line, and your access to services changes. Step too far out of line, and your existence becomes restricted. This is captivity without walls, a prison made of data where compliance is rewarded and dissent is punished without ever needing handcuffs. Think also of medicine's future. Willowbrook was about deliberate exposure to hepatitis. Tomorrow's experiments may involve genetic editing, neuromodulation, or AI-driven behavioral engineering. The vulnerable, the poor, the marginalized, the voiceless will again be first in line. Trials will be framed as opportunities, access to cutting-edge treatments. But look closer. Are these opportunities, or are they new forms of exploitation? Every trial requires bodies, and history shows us that the bodies chosen are always those least able to refuse. Willowbrook was a laboratory for hepatitis. The laboratories of the future will be entire populations enrolled not with permission, but with inevitability. And what of AI? Imagine an institution not run by humans, but by algorithms. Decisions about who receives care, who is admitted, who is denied, all made by systems trained on data sets. Cold, efficient, logical. But what if those data sets are biased? What if they encode the same hierarchies that allowed Willowbrook to exist? The belief that some lives are worth less, some voices less credible, some people less human. Then the algorithm becomes the new asylum, a machine that justifies neglect not through malice, but through math. And who will question it? Who will fight a system that says, the data demands it? Just as parents once trusted doctors at Willowbrook, tomorrow's society may trust algorithms blind to the exploitation hidden inside their logic. You may think, surely we would never allow another Willowbrook. But history says otherwise. Every generation believes it is more enlightened than the one before, and yet every generation repeats the same Kes, only dressed in new clothes. The 19th century had insane asylums. The 20th century had Willowbrook. The 21st will have algorithmic prisons, genetic laboratories, biometric surveillance grids. The faces change, but the logic remains. Isolate, redefine, normalize. Always the same pattern, always justified by progress. This is why Willowbrook must be remembered not as a scandal of the past, but as a prophecy. Because if you understand the blueprint, you can predict the future. The warning is clear. Whenever you hear the words necessary, inevitable, or for your own good, you must listen closely. Those were the very words that allowed parents to sign away their children. Those were the very words that turned suffering into research. Those are the very words being used today to justify surveillance, data extraction, and manipulation at scales. Willowbrook's architects could never have imagined. Let us push this further. Imagine a future where corporations own not just your data, but your biology. Where gene editing companies patent not just treatments, but traits. Where the definition of normal is rewritten according to profit margins. In such a world, children like those at Willowbrook would not merely be warehoused. They would be redesigned, optimized, erased. And those who resist? They will be categorized as non-compliant, as burdens to the system, as expendable. Willowbrook was about containment. The future may be about erasure. A more final captivity, where difference itself is eliminated in the name of progress. And here is the most chilling thought. The future asylum will not feel like an asylum at all. It will feel like convenience. It will feel like personalization. It will feel like freedom. You will be told that every choice is yours, when in reality, every choice will be guided, shaped, and limited by systems you cannot see. That is the ultimate captivity, when you believe you are free while living inside walls invisible to the eye. The children of Willowbrook knew they were trapped. Will the future generations even realize it? This is the legacy of Willowbrook. Not only that children suffered in silence, but that their suffering revealed the structure of control itself. And if we refuse to see it, if we treat it only as history, then we guarantee that it will return, not in the form of crumbling wards and overcrowded dormitories, but in polished labs and glowing screens. The snake pit of the past becomes the smart prison of the future. So ask yourself, when the next Willowbrook arrives, will you recognize it? Will you have the clarity to see through the promises, the courage to resist inevitability, the strength to say no? Or will you, like so many before, tell yourself you have no choice? That is the decision that lies ahead. That is the decision that decides whether the children of Willowbrook suffered in vain, or whether their silent cries echo forward as the warning we finally choose to hear. There is a truth more disturbing than the images of overcrowded wards, more haunting than the photographs of children tied to beds or smeared in filth. That truth is this. Willowbrook was not just an institution that failed its children. Willowbrook was a mirror, showing us the fragility of humanity itself. What does it mean to be human if entire populations can be reduced to test subjects? What does it mean to have dignity if that dignity can be stripped away with a signature on a consent form? What does it mean to be free if captivity can be renamed as care? So questions linger long after the walls of Willowbrook were torn down, and they are questions we still do not know how to answer. At its core, Willowbrook was a machine of dehumanization. Every institution like it begins with a quiet shift in language. Children became patients, patients became subjects, subjects became data. The transformation is subtle but devastating. Once you are data, you are no longer a person. You are a number in a file, a line in a study, an entry in a ledger. You can be categorized, manipulated, forgotten. The staff at Willowbrook did not wake up each morning and tell themselves they were torturers. They told themselves they were caretakers, researchers, professionals. But the children in their beds knew a different truth. They were forgotten bodies, living evidence of society's indifference. The real horror of Willowbrook is not in the cruelty of individuals, but in the way entire systems can make cruelty ordinary. A nurse straps down a child because that is policy. A doctor infects a patient because that is research. A parent signs a form because there is no alternative. Everyone believes they are simply following the script, and in that script, no one is evil, but everyone becomes complicit. That is the true machinery of dehumanization. Not sadism, but obedience. Not monsters, but ordinary people doing their jobs. Now imagine this same machinery scaled up into the future. Imagine a world where algorithms replace administrators. The script is written not in policy manuals, but in code. A decision is made about you, not by a person, but by a system. Are you eligible for care? Are you worthy of resources? Are you flagged as a risk? The system does not hate you. It does not even notice you. It simply categorizes you, like the children at Willowbrook were categorized, and then acts accordingly. And when you protest, who will you appeal to? A human who says, the algorithm decided. A machine that does not know the meaning of compassion? In such a world, humanity itself risks becoming obsolete. And yet, there is something deeper still. A spiritual cost that Willowbrook forces us to confront. If a society can confine its most vulnerable in filth and darkness, what does that say about the soul of that society? If progress can be built on the suffering of children, what kind of progress is it? Every experiment conducted at Willowbrook was not only an assault on those children's bodies, but also on the very meaning of morality. It was a desecration, a ritual sacrifice of innocence in the name of science. And once such sacrifices become acceptable, where does the line end? Some might argue that human progress has always required sacrifice, that every advance, from medicine to technology, is written in blood. But ask yourself, whose blood, whose bodies? It is never the privileged who are experimented upon. It is always the voiceless, the powerless, the unseen. Willowbrook's children were offered up because society had already decided they did not matter. They were, in the coldest sense, expendable. And if humanity is measured by how we treat the expendable, then Willowbrook is evidence of a humanity in crisis. There is a darker possibility, one too uncomfortable for most to acknowledge. What if Willowbrook was not an aberration, but a revelation? What if it showed us not how far we strayed, but who we truly are? The history of civilization is not a steady march toward enlightenment, but a cycle of exploitation hidden under new justifications. Slavery becomes industry, colonization becomes globalization, asylums become research centers, always the same pattern. Some lives are stripped of meaning so that others may prosper. In this sense, Willowbrook is not just history, it is destiny, unless we choose to break the pattern. But breaking the pattern requires more than outrage. Outrage fades. It requires more than reforms. Reforms adapt. What is required is a redefinition of humanity itself. We must learn to see value not in productivity, not in intelligence, not in conformity, but in existence itself. A child in a bed at Willowbrook was no less human than a doctor holding a clipboard. A body with hepatitis was no less sacred than a body writing research papers. Until humanity is measured by presence, by being, rather than by usefulness, the cycle will continue. Because the moment usefulness becomes the measure, someone will always be deemed useless. Someone will always become the next subject. And so Willowbrook forces us to ask, what is a human being? A mind? A body? A soul? Or something irreducible that resists categorization? The institution tried to define those children as defective, as less than, as unworthy. But if you listen closely, not to the official reports, not to the research papers, but to the silence of those children, you hear a different definition. To be human is to suffer, yes, but also to resist, to endure, to exist even when the world tries to erase you. The children of Willowbrook were more than subjects. They were witnesses, witnesses to the limits of cruelty and to the resilience of being itself. Perhaps this is the final lesson Willowbrook offers. The true danger is not only that we forget what happened. The true danger is that we forget why it matters. Because if we forget, we will look at new systems of control, the glowing algorithms, the polished labs, the seamless surveillance, and we will not see cruelty. We will see only convenience. And in that moment, the silence of Willowbrook's children will echo louder than ever, asking us the same unanswerable question. What does it mean to be human? There is a point where history ceases to be a warning and becomes a prophecy. Willowbrook lives in that threshold. It whispers of what happens when captivity is normalized, when suffering becomes data, when innocence is turned into fuel for progress. And if we follow that whisper forward into the shadows of tomorrow, we glimpse the endgame. A world remade in Willowbrook's image, a global asylum without escape. Imagine it. Borders dissolve, not in the name of freedom, but in the name of surveillance. Every nation becomes a ward, every city a locked wing, every citizen a patient. You are tracked from birth, categorized by risk factors, monitored for compliance. Your health records, your genetic profile, your behavior online, all stitched together into a single identity that defines what you are allowed to do, where you are allowed to go, how long you are allowed to exist. The justification will sound familiar. Safety, efficiency, public good. But beneath the polished surface is the same logic that justified hepatitis injections at Willowbrook. It will happen anyway, so why not control it? And just like Willowbrook, this new asylum will thrive, not because of monsters, but because of compliance. People will not be dragged screaming into cells. They will step willingly into the system, told it is inevitable, told it is necessary. Their captivity will not feel like chains. It will feel like order, the same way parents signed away their children because there was no alternative. Entire populations will sign away their autonomy because the world is too dangerous without it. The locks will not be visible. They will be coded into infrastructure, into algorithms, into the very architecture of daily life. In this asylum, freedom will become a managed illusion. You will choose your meals from menus already curated for you. You will travel through spaces designed to track your every step. You will speak words monitored for deviation. And you will believe this is normal, even desirable, because you will have forgotten that another way was ever possible. Captivity is easiest to endure when you no longer recognize it as captivity at all. But every asylum, no matter how vast, requires its forgotten. Just as Willowbrook warehoused children society did not want to see, the global asylum will designate its new expendables. Those who resist will be labeled defective. Those who cannot adapt will be marginalized. Their exclusion will be explained as optimization, as efficiency. They will not be locked in physical wards, but they will be digitally erased, denied access to healthcare, to communication, to movement. Their punishment will not be violence, but invisibility. They will simply vanish from the system, and the system will move on without them. This is the final form of Willowbrook's logic, not just confinement, but erasure. The institution of the future does not need to tie children to beds. It only needs to decide that certain children do not exist. With a flick of code, they are unpersoned. Without recognition, without acknowledgement, they drift into silence, and silence, as Willowbrook taught us, is the cruelest prison of all. But do not comfort yourself with the idea that you will be spared. In the global asylum, no one is safe. At Willowbrook, the line between patient and subject was thin. One day you were a child needing care, the next you were a vessel for disease. In the world to come, the line between citizen and captive will be just as thin. A single deviation, a single refusal, and you may find yourself reclassified. Today's privilege is tomorrow's liability. And once you are reclassified, there is no return. The system does not forget. And here lies the apocalyptic truth. A global asylum does not collapse under its own weight. It grows stronger with every act of compliance. The more people surrender, the more seamless it becomes. It does not end in chaos, but in perfect order, an order so complete that it erases not only freedom, but even the memory of freedom. The children of Willowbrook knew they were prisoners. The citizens of the global asylum may never know. They may mistake their walls for protection, their restraints for safety, their silence for peace, and in that mistake, humanity itself dissolves. You might think this is distant, that such a system belongs to dystopian fiction, but look around. The seeds are already planted, surveillance cameras on every corner, biometric scans at every border, data harvested from every device, predictive algorithms deciding who gets hired, who gets arrested, who gets medicine. These are not the future, they are the present. Willowbrook was a building, but the new asylum does not need buildings. It needs only networks, codes, and trust, and we have already given it our trust. Ask yourself, how much of your life is already decided without your knowledge? How many of your choices are shaped by invisible systems? How many freedoms have you traded for convenience, for safety, for efficiency? Every time you unlock your phone with your face, every time you sign a digital agreement without reading, every time you accept terms and conditions in exchange for access, you step deeper into the ward. Step by step, quietly, willingly, you enter Willowbrook's shadow. And here is the most chilling realization. The global asylum may not need guards, because the prisoners will police themselves. Social pressure, algorithmic nudges, reputational scores, these will be the new restraints. You will correct yourself before the system ever needs to correct you. You will fear deviation not because you are punished, but because you fear being excluded. And so, captivity becomes self-sustaining. The asylum expands without walls, powered not by force, but by the quiet obedience of billions. At the end of this road lies the true apocalypse, not fire, not collapse, but permanence. A humanity so deeply institutionalized that escape is no longer imaginable. A world where every life is monitored, optimized, and predetermined. A world where children like those at Willowbrook no longer suffer in silence, because silence itself will be universal. No cries, no protests, no resistance. Just the endless hum of a machine that has replaced freedom with order, individuality with data, humanity with compliance. This is the world Willowbrook warns us of, not a snake pit hidden on Staten Island, but a planet-sized institution hidden in plain sight. And the question is not whether it can happen. The question is whether we will recognize it as it happens, or whether, like the parents who signed their children away, we will tell ourselves there is no alternative. That is the final captivity, not the prison of walls, but the prison of inevitability. We have walked the halls of Willowbrook. We have seen the children confined, the experiments justified, the silence normalized. We have traced the logic outward, into algorithms, into surveillance, into the skeleton of a world becoming one vast institution. But now we reach the end, and with it, the question that lingers like an unanswered echo. What is to be done? Can there be resistance in a world built on captivity? Can there be freedom in a world designed as an asylum? The first truth we must confront is this. Willowbrook was never truly dismantled. The buildings closed, yes. The headlines condemned it, yes. But the logic, the machinery of confinement, the quiet compliance, the transformation of people into data, that logic lived on. It shifted shape, found new disguises, new hosts. To believe Willowbrook ended in 1987 is to believe in a comfortable lie. Willowbrook did not end. It evolved. The second truth is more difficult still. Resistance will not look like revolution. Do not imagine mobs tearing down walls or governments passing laws that end exploitation. Those walls are gone, and those governments are part of the system. Resistance will not be grand. It will be small, fragile, almost invisible. It will begin in the refusal to comply, in the courage to say no when everything demands yes. It will begin in remembering that Willowbrook happened, remembering that its children existed, remembering that captivity is not inevitable, even when the world insists it is. Because forgetting is the fuel of institutions. Forgetting allows history to repeat, cruelty to normalize, suffering to be erased. That is why the silence of Willowbrook's children still matters. It is not just a silence of the past. It is a silence that warns us, that begs us to listen. Silence is the one thing the institution could not fully control. It lingers like a ghost, a wound that never closes. To resist the future asylum, we must listen to that silence. We must allow it to haunt us. We must refuse to let it fade into comfort. But even as we remember, we must also reckon with the darker possibility. What if resistance is futile? What if the machinery is too vast, the compliance too deep, the surveillance too complete? What if the asylum has already become global and all that remains is acceptance? This is the temptation, to surrender, to tell ourselves that captivity is simply the cost of safety, of progress, of belonging. This temptation is the final victory of Willowbrook's logic. Because the moment we accept inevitability, the walls close forever. And that is why even futile resistance matters. Even if it cannot topple the system, it can preserve the ember of humanity. It can remind us, and those who come after us, that freedom was once possible, and maybe again. Consider the children of Willowbrook. By every measure, they were powerless. They could not escape. They could not fight. Many could not even speak. Yet their very existence, their endurance in the face of erasure, became testimony. Without intending, without knowing, they bore witness to the cruelty of the system that confined them, and in bearing witness, they left behind something indestructible, truth. A truth so unbearable that the world tried to bury it, but a truth that surfaced nonetheless. In the same way, our resistance may not topple the asylum, but it can bear witness. It can say, we saw, we remembered, we refused to forget. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the measure of humanity is not victory, but witness, not triumph, but refusal, to look at the walls of the asylum, whether of brick or of code, and to say, this is not all that we are. To remember the children of Willowbrook not as victims, but as mirrors. Mirrors showing us who we are, who we could be, and who we must never become. In the end, the Willowbrook scandal is not about hepatitis, or overcrowded wards, or government neglect. It is about the question that runs like a fracture through all of human history. Will we treat each other as people, or as things? As ends in themselves, or as means to an end? Willowbrook answered that question with cruelty, with neglect, with silence, but we do not have to accept that answer. We can choose differently. We can choose to see humanity in those the world calls expendable. We can choose to resist the machinery of erasure, even when resistance feels meaningless. We can choose to remember. So let this be the final word. Willowbrook is not a story about the past. It is a story about us, about what we allow, about what we ignore, about the systems we build and the silences we accept. It is a story that ends only if we end it. Otherwise, it will echo forward, repeating itself in new forms, in new names, in new asylums. And if we are not vigilant, we will wake one day to find that we have built a Willowbrook so vast, so seamless, that escape is no longer imaginable. That is the apocalypse. That is the warning. But there is another ending, faint but possible, an ending in which we refuse inevitability, an ending in which we see every child, every person, as irreducibly human. An ending in which we carry the silence of Willowbrook's children not as a burden, but as a fire that burns through lies, through justifications, through inevitabilities, a fire that refuses to go out, a fire that whispers, even in the darkest wards, we are more than subjects, we are more than data, we are human. And perhaps, if enough of us keep that fire alive, the world need not become a global asylum. Perhaps Willowbrook's true legacy can be more than despair. Perhaps it can be warning, resistance, and redemption. Perhaps the children who suffered there did not suffer in vain. Their silence calls to us. The question is whether we will listen. The question is whether we will act. The question is whether at last we will choose to be human.